Hi, TheHande here, and today we're talking about Castlevania, and specifically Castlevania Judgment. Castlevania Judgment was an arena fighting game commissioned by Konami and released by them in 2008. The game itself was developed by a studio called a.k.a, who did a bunch of those Naruto games back in the day, which explains the gameplay style. Who watched my video on the history of the Castlevania series might remember that this game came out at a time when Konami was a little bit desperate to try to attain some mainstream recognition for the series. The game was released on the Nintendo Wii and featured 12 recognizable Castlevania characters from across the entire history of the series up to that point, redesigned by Takeshi Obata, better known as the author of Death Note. Now, while the game itself was not hugely successful, it was kind of an interesting look back and a nod to the rich lore of the Castlevania franchise. And in this video, following on these little analyses videos of video game characters, I thought that I would like to take a look at the 12 characters, 9 of whom are playable characters from past Castlevania installments, and 3 of whom are monsters from the games. Give a little background information about each and every one of them. And of course, first up, we're gonna start with the man, the myth himself, Simon Belmont, who simultaneously is the Belmont with the most game appearances to his name. Ironically, I think he might actually be the least interesting Belmont of the entire franchise. The simple reality of this is that while Simon has appeared in numerous games, almost every single one of those games is literally nothing but a retelling of his first appearance. Simon, of course, appeared in the very first Castlevania back in 1986, with the only exception to his gaming history that isn't a remake of the original being Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. For a character who has been a part of the lore for this long, it's actually kind of funny to think that Simon is probably least consistently portrayed of the Belmonts. I mean, his outfit has changed multiple times throughout the series' run, though it typically kind of ranges from this kind of generic-looking brown number that he wears in a number of the games. Sometimes he has a headband, sometimes not. Occasionally he has this red armor like on the box of Castlevania 2. But by the late 90s, when the series' official artist had become Ayami Kojima, whom we'll talk about in a minute, at least finally nailed down a standard hair color for Simon, which is apparently red. Because before this had been literally every other color under the sun, from brown to purple. I actually kind of personally like the look that he had on Captain and the Game Master. This is probably my favorite version of Simon, period. But of course, I understand why they probably picked Simon, because he was the first Belmont in the series, although chronologically, of course, not so much. Simon's adventure kind of falls somewhere in the middle of the Castlevania chronology. Next we have Trevor Belmont, whom some of you might actually recognize, not because of the games he was in, but because, of course, he was the protagonist of the Netflix Castlevania cartoon that happened a little while ago. In fact, the Castlevania Netflix series is a pretty direct adaptation of both of Trevor's 2 big games, Castlevania 3 all the way back on the NES, and then Castlevania Curse of Darkness on the PlayStation 2. Yeah, that is quite a gap. Now, despite the title, Trevor's adventure actually took place far before Simon's. What's interesting is that all the playable characters from Castlevania 3 basically are playable characters in Judgment as well. Trevor represents an era in the Castlevania history where the Belmonts were kind of down and out, and they played that up also in the Netflix series, which was kind of nice. However, Trevor himself in the original game was literally nothing but a clone of Simon. However, during the Ayami Kojima era, they finally gave Trevor a recognizable signature, which is carried over into Judgment, which is giving him an eye patch. I remember being a little bit disappointed that it did not carry over into the Netflix series. Next up, we have one of Trevor's 3 companions from the original Castlevania 3, which is Alucard, the son of Dracula. Now, Alucard is obviously not his real name, it's literally just Dracula spelled backwards. His canonical name is actually Adrian Tepes, but he takes on the mantle of Alucard because he is in opposition to his father. Alucard is kind of like the breakout star of the Castlevania franchise because he was also the main protagonist in the first PlayStation Castlevania title, Symphony of the Night, which is a direct sequel to my favorite Castlevania game, Rondo of Blood. And his appearance in the game is obviously based on the redesign by Ayami Kojima, who went on to redesign basically all of the Castlevania characters after the mid-90s. And this is the design that his Netflix appearance was also based on, because if you look back at his original appearance in Castlevania 3, you can kind of tell that they were just basing him on his dad, who at this point was also being depicted kind of just as a clone of a generic-looking vampire, or occasionally Bela Lugosi. Now, his name Alucard is actually a pretty fringe reference to a sequel to the Bela Lugosi Dracula called Son of Dracula. Spoiler alert, it is not actually about Dracula's son. The premise of the movie is literally that Count Dracula is going under the assumed title of Count Alucard to hide his identity. Anyway, even the Netflix series did put a little bit of sprinklings of Symphony of the Night into its story, since Symphony was the game that originally explained what Dracula's beef was. Basically, Alucard is the son of Dracula and a mortal woman who was later killed, and Dracula's reign of terror is basically him trying to get vengeance for the death of his wife. Next we have Sypha Belnades, who is an elemental witch from the original Castlevania 3. Her appearance in Judgment is quite dramatically different from her original appearance, though to be fair, Sypha was pretty understated in the original game. So much so that Konami's infamously unreliable American division even incorrectly identified her as a man in their original manual. Anyway, in Judgment, she's been kind of made into this kind of a crusading magic user, if that makes any kind of sense, which is funny because that's totally not what she is in the Netflix series. In fact, I am going to admit that before I saw the Netflix series, I always assumed her name was pronounced Belnades. I think in the official canon of the series, she and Trevor do actually end up together, and the last of the three companions from Castlevania 3 is DaNasty. DaNasty is literally just a pirate whose crew was killed by Dracula, and that's why he is out for revenge. I gotta admit, he's probably the least interesting of Trevor's companions in the game, but I still thought it was kind of sad that he was completely left out of the Netflix series, except there was maybe a slight reference to him in one of the beginnings of the episodes. Anyway, Grant has obviously gone over quite a dramatic design revamp in Judgment. He looks more like a mummy to me than a pirate. And I know in the game they pronounce his last name as DaNasty. I refuse to pronounce it that way though. Next up we have Maria Renard, who is one of the two playable characters in Rondo of Blood, and she actually later also appears in Symphony of the Night. She is the younger sister of Annette Renard, who is the damsel in distress that Richter is trying to save in Rondo of Blood. Though I should stress that in order to successfully save her, you actually have to do a little side quest inside the game. It's not enough to just play it all the way to the end. And if the player rescues Maria early on in the game, she then of course becomes a playable character, as I said. Her role in Symphony of the Night is really just as a support character, although the game also hints that she might have some romantic feelings for Alucard. Anyway, in her playable appearance, she uses a number of animals as her special abilities, as opposed to the special items that Richter uses. These include a dragon, a cat, a turtle, and birds. In fact, it's my understanding that these different animals actually are supposed to represent the cardinal directions in Japanese lore, and they have some kind of mythological significance that way. Just like Sypha, her redesign is a little bit questionable. Although I do think that she had probably one of the goofiest and most funny story modes in Judgment. Next we have Eric Lacarde, who is one of the two playable characters from Castlevania Bloodlines, a.k.a. Castlevania The New Generation. For those of you who are not aware, the Castlevania game series pretty blatantly incorporates Bram Stoker's Dracula into its storyline. It takes place in a kind of a bizarre period in the series' history. After Symphony of the Night, the Belmont clan briefly loses control of the vampire killer whip, and so there's a bunch of these randos also taking up the fight against Dracula because of them, one of whom is John Morris, the son of Quincy Morris, who is a character in the Stoker novel. Those of you who have actually read the novel will be able to point out why it doesn't make a lick of sense that Quincy would have a son. But anyway, John is helped on his quest by Eric, who is the second playable character in Bloodlines. Bloodlines is one of those games that originally I wasn't too hot on, but I have actually started to come around to a lot in recent years. And I guess it's just novel to consider, because Castlevania didn't really ever have a big presence on the Sega consoles. I will point out, however, that Eric is a lot younger in Judgment than he was in the game, which I find kind of funny, because if you know anything about Castlevania Bloodlines' weird history of localization, of course, in Europe the game's name was changed from Bloodlines to far less interesting New Generation, and I heard the official explanation being that they did this because the original game had blood in the title, which would have caused problems when the game was released in Germany. I don't understand that, because obviously it doesn't have anything to do with actual blood. Even between the American and Japanese version, they actually made Eric look a lot more manly, because he was a bit effeminate originally. Yeah, Konami's weird like that. Next we have Cornell, who is interesting because he is a character from Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, the often forgotten second installment of the Castlevania series on Nintendo 64. Despite its infamy, the original Castlevania 64, or just Castlevania for Nintendo 64, was actually a commercial success, which is why Konami decided to quickly hash out a sequel, which included a completely original story. Cornell is a werewolf who is trying to stop his werewolf brethren from serving Dracula in the story of that game. What I find interesting about this is the fact that Aiding decided to include Cornell because Castlevania Legacy of Darkness is one of 4 Castlevania games that the series producer
Koji Igarashi
discounted from the series timeline. According to
Koji Igarashi,
Legends, Castlevania 64, Legacy of Darkness, and Circle of the Moon were all removed because they all caused problems for the timeline of the series. In the case of the N64 titles and Circle of the Moon, because they're set in that same nebulous time period after Symphony of the Night, where the Belmonts were supposed to have the vampire killer whip anymore. This causes some issues. Anyway, in the story of Judgment, Cornell is apparently just trying to cure himself of his werewolfism, or lycanthropy. And the last of the playable characters is Shanoa from Order of Ecclesia. I actually had to Wikipedia wizard myself through this one because I have not played this particular game, but at the time of Judgment's release, it was one of the newer Metroidvanias that had come out for Nintendo's handhelds. Order of Ecclesia, it also takes place in the same weird post-Symphony of the Night timeline, where an order of wizards called the Order of Ecclesia is trying to battle Dracula. Shanoa is apparently, however, possessed by some kind of a demon, and this is a significant part of the storyline. I kind of find her pseudo-nun outfit in the game a bit weird, because in the official art she looks quite a bit more wild. I don't know, I guess Obata was just kind of reaching to make her look different from the other female characters. Next on the list, of course, is Death, aka the Grim Reaper, who is a recurring boss throughout most of the Castlevania games. Oftentimes, although not always, he's the second to last boss in these games. Now, as cool as I found the idea of fighting the Grim Reaper in those old games, in subsequent years, I have always kind of found it a bit weird that Death is supposed to be Dracula's servant in these games. However, I believe nowadays I kind of understand that Konami maybe doesn't treat the Grim Reaper in the Castlevania series as the literal personification of Death, but rather as kind of an evil Shinigami. Shinigamis are the death gods in Japanese folklore. You might be aware of them if you've heard of this anime called Bleach. But anyway, his Judgment redesign is kinda all over the place. He looks like some kind of a freaky robot. Another puzzling character is the Golem. I had to actually look this up, but apparently this Golem specifically is supposed to be the one from the obscure Castlevania arcade title Haunted Castle, which just raises even more questions, because if you look at him, he doesn't look anything like the character from the game. Golems, by the way, are characters from Jewish folklore. They are basically a non-thinking, human-shaped creature made out of clay and brought to life by mystic forces. But in Japanese media, Golem was eventually just kind of reappropriated into a generic term, meaning any kind of human-like creature that is made out of some unliving material, like rocks and stuff. In fact, the original Castlevania Golem also just kind of looks like a generic rock monster, and the Golem has appeared as just a regular stage enemy in subsequent games as well. Which it really doesn't make any sense, because the Golem in Judgment is very clearly made of organic parts. Now, I'm just gonna hazard a guess here and say that what the Castlevania Judgment developers really wanted to do was to include the Frankenstein's monster as one of the playable characters, because he has been a recurring boss in the game series since the very beginning. But over concerns of copyright issues, they just decided to substitute his name with another monster. Because in the game, the Golem is basically just riddled with this existential crisis of why is he even alive. Which is a cute idea, but I just have to admit, the Golem is probably my least favorite character to even play in the game. And lastly, we come to Carmilla. Now, this is super interesting because Carmilla is technically not a character from the games per se, but some of you might recognize that a character like this did appear in the Netflix television series. Carmilla, or occasionally spelled Camilla, is just a generic boss character name that has been used by multiple monsters in the Castlevania series, but it has its origins in Castlevania 2, where you fight Carmilla's mask, which is literally just a giant mask that flies around the room, dropping what seem to be bloody tears. But the point here is that right up until Judgment, Carmilla had never been fully nailed down as a specific character from the franchise, which means that this is actually one thing where Castlevania Judgment might have been ahead of the curve by actually giving her her own personality. In the game, she's just a female vampire scheming to overthrow Dracula, and obviously included for some cheap fan service, as if you couldn't tell. Anyway, those were the Castlevania characters from Castlevania Judgment and their character histories. I hope you found this video enjoyable. I'm TheHande, see you on the next one.